I'm John Glick, and I work for a company called Cochranville Ag Service. We are a small agricultural services company in Southeast Pennsylvania, and I love what's been shared so far. I already can see some more use cases coming up for some things that we're doing in our business. So I'm going to talk today about running FME workspaces from Salesforce, and we've started using this to integrate Salesforce with some other things that we do, and it's been working really great. So yeah, there's a picture of some of our equipment, and we use FME a lot to capture data from that equipment. FME, yeah, has become, like I said, a great enterprise integration platform for us. Mitchell Copper once said that getting information off the internet is like taking a drink from a fire hose. And many times, that's how my Salesforce users feel. There's so much information available to them, but how do they get it exactly and easily and precisely the way they want it? And that's the problem solved in the example that I'm using today. And really, the problem begins with just the sheer amount of data we have. So the report that is generated by my workspace today is what we call a crop rotation report. And in the work that we do for our clients, it's essential that we know what crop is in the field before we arrive. Certain things that we put on the field will kill certain crops and let other ones live. So we got to know what's there, or else we're going to have a really expensive problem on our hands. So hence the need for a crop rotation database. And in Southeast Pennsylvania, with 7 or 8 main crops plus double crop scenarios, this can become quite complex. In addition, our fields average only 8 or 9 acres. And yes, we apply product to 4,000 different fields every season. And so you can do a lot of neat things just inside Salesforce, especially if you're a developer. You can do a lot of great things without FME. I'm not a developer. And so when it came down to my users using my crop rotation report inside Salesforce, it just wasn't cutting it for them. And this is the example of that report. My users just complained that it didn't arrange the data the way they wanted it. They had to export it to Excel and move columns around, move data around. They were not happy at all with that. And they did tell me exactly what they wanted. And I couldn't say no because I have FME, right? And here is an example of what they wanted and what I was able to eventually deliver with FME. The problem was that they didn't want to leave Salesforce. So they wanted the report to just come to them by pressing a button. They wanted it to come to their email or maybe be downloaded exactly the way they wanted it without leaving Salesforce. And it turns out that's pretty simple to do, to leverage the power of FME and never leave Salesforce. There are 3 ingredients that are needed for that. The first is a workspace running on FME server in the cloud or your own server. We need a Salesforce Aurora component available for flow actions. And inside Salesforce, then we need a flow or another way to utilize the Aurora component. So the first ingredient is a workspace that's published to FME server. And depending on your use case, you will need published parameters. In the case that I'm using as an example, I have 4. 3 of these provide information that FME needs to query the crop rotations we have stored in Salesforce. The 4th parameter specifies the location of the Excel template to use. I'm using the Excel template as a part of this to help with the formatting of the report. So write down the names of these parameters when you're setting this up. Write them exactly the way you have them in FME in your workspace, because you're going to need them later, and it's got to be exactly the way you have them there. So the first ingredient is the workspace, and here's my workspace. The second ingredient is a Lightning component, and this component will play 2 roles basically. It will take the parameters from the Salesforce flow. I'm using flow in my case. You can use other methods, and place them into a JavaScript array And that JavaScript is then pushed to the FME server REST API as the published parameters for the workspace. But that's very basic JavaScript. You can either find it on Salesforce Trailhead or other places online. The other role that it plays is it will listen for a response from the FME server, and it will feed that response back to the Salesforce flow to tell the user what happened. In my case, I'm running an asynchronous job, so it feeds back the ID of the job when it gets the ID, and then Salesforce basically tells the user, hey, look, the job has been submitted, you're good to go. So here's a quick shot of how my component looks inside the flow. And you can see here I have various things set up here that I can turn on or off depending on my use case. I kind of designed this to be able to be portable to use inside other flows. So the most important one here for this, in this case, is the parameters. One that you can see I have included there. And that's really important because that's where my flow passes the parameters into the component. So the last ingredient then is a flow inside Salesforce. Well, you could really do everything inside a Lightning component if you wanted to, or using Lightning web components. I like to use flow. So the flow is pretty simple. It basically, the progression of how it works is it receives the record ID from the UI. It gets an FME server token via a subflow. It assigns variables then based off of some screen selections and makes a quick query to get an ID and puts that information into a text template. And that text template is what creates the published parameters for the FME workspace inside that's running in the cloud. Then my component makes the call to the FME server API, and it brings the response back to the flow. So here's a shot of my flow. It's very simple and basically runs very quickly through those things. A little bit about the variables and the published parameters. Basically, there's a couple things to make sure that you do when you are setting this up. One of them is, and I was going to show a picture of this, somehow I missed it. But you're basically, we talked about JSON earlier. The text template for the inside the flow sets up the parameters in a JSON array, and so you can set those up via a text template. It's very easy to do that. You're just copying and pasting in the template, and then inside the template, you're assigning the variables from your flow to the different published parameters before they even go into my component to get sent to the REST API. So there's a couple tips and tricks. Write down your published parameters when you're creating your workspace. So it's very important that you have them exactly the same, and you're going to have to write them down inside the Salesforce flow so that the Salesforce knows what parameters to send to the API. So it's also helpful to have a standard method of naming your published parameters, maybe across your organization. I have found that I have several workspaces that do this, and so I might have what's called a grower ID for one, and one workspace I may have capitalize the I, and another one I didn't. So it's really helpful to have a standard method of naming published parameters. Understand the difference between an asynchronous and synchronous API call. That's basically, there's documentation there, and I have a link there to the REST API documentation, and in the documentation, it tells you the difference. Basically, an asynchronous call, you'll get an ID back telling you what ID your job is on the server. A synchronous call will on the other hand, push back the data. And so if you have a synchronous call, you can actually receive data back from the REST API and digest that then inside Salesforce. So there is a developer web page for Salesforce that I use to create this Lightning component that I'm using. And I have the link there. And finally, use Trailhead if you're working with the the flow and the components. There's plenty of information on Trailhead that will walk you right through the different steps to set this up, at least on the Salesforce side of things. So I'm going to do a quick demo now just to demonstrate for you how this works inside Salesforce. And so here's my customer in Salesforce. And I can just click here where it says crop rotation report and ask me a question or two. And I get this message. It's telling me that the job was submitted successfully and it's going to be emailed to me. And I will switch back to my other screen and show you the email. All right, so here's my email with the attachment, and I'm opening the attachment up. All right, there's how my report looks. So that's all that it takes to get that going. And my users were very happy with that. They can print this out. There's even links to the Salesforce records if they want to take a look at that. And they've been very happy with that. Just to conclude here, the power of FME can be leveraged inside Salesforce, resulting in data delivered your way, formatted exactly the way you want it, and happy and productive users. And there's a few other ways that I'm using this in Salesforce, this concept. I'm using it to consume links to maps generated by FME, click to open an FME server app where the parameters are just supplied directly by Salesforce. I am using HTML and JavaScript reports filled with data from various sources, which FME is pulling that in for me. So there's a lot of potential here. Go create.